Many Albertans, including our very own Premier Jason Kenney, are not happy with how much our province gives out in equalization payments each and every year. To talk more about it, more detail, is Ben Eisen. Ben is a senior fellow with the Fraser Institute and is co-author of the report, Equalization and Stabilization Post-Recession, Is Canada Ready? Ben, welcome to BCN.
Thanks so much.
So Ben, can you briefly explain how equalization really works and its purpose?
It's a relatively straightforward program. There's some complexities in the details, but big picture, it's relatively straightforward. What happens is the federal government collects tax revenue, just like from people all across, people and businesses all across the country, and it goes into the general revenue. And one of the things that they use that money for is the equalization program. And the equalization program is pretty simple. What it does is it takes federal revenue and it sends it, just pretty much direct cash payments, to lower income provinces in the country, to provinces that are deemed to be less able to provide quality public services to their residents without higher levels of taxation. So it's pretty straightforward. The federal government figures out through a formula which the lower income provinces are and sends their government some money.
You know, Alberta's been forking out billions upon billions of dollars each and every year. Premier Kenney's talked about how much Quebec has received, Ontario has received. Alberta sometimes has received the short end of the stick. Will our province be receiving some of that money back as we're still trying to recover from a pre-COVID-19 recession?
No, Alberta will not receive any equalization payments now or the foreseeable future. The reason for that is that Alberta still, despite all of the terrible economic hardship, still has higher average incomes than people in most other parts of the country, than in any other province, actually. So the way that equalization works, Alberta can't become eligible. But what's interesting is that Alberta has also not been eligible for very significant payments under the stabilization program. That's a cousin of the equalization program, designed to help provinces, even if they're higher income like Alberta, that have taken a hard hit. And quirks of the program, that one, have meant that it really has provided very little help for Alberta during this very difficult time. So if you sort of think of the two together, equalization and its less known friend, the stabilization program, you can say that they haven't served Alberta well and that Alberta's received very little money out of either program.
Ben, should Alberta have received some payments perhaps during the oil collapse in 2014?
Well, Alberta did receive at that time some stabilization payments, but they're just a drop in the bucket in terms of how small. There's an arbitrary cap on the amount. It's $60 per person. The reasons for that cap are sort of silly. They're rooted in an event that happened in the lumber industry in British Columbia in the 1980s. It's ad hoc and arbitrary, and it's not well designed or thought through. So Alberta did receive a small amount of money through stabilization back then, but the amount was not determined by a sensible formula. If you want to have a stabilization program that's designed to help governments deal with it when there's serious shocks to the economy, such as occurred in Alberta in 2014-15, and such is happening again today, then that program needs a fundamental rethink, because right now it's designed so that it can do no more but deliver a drop in the bucket to help a province like Alberta when it's going through a shock like it is today.
Do you think we will ever have a referendum here in Alberta on equalization, Ben? And if so, would the federal Liberals even listen or take notice?
Well, the Premier says that there will be a referendum. Premier Kenney says there will be a referendum. The Fair Deal panel, which the government struck, recommended a referendum on equalization. So the signs do look like it will happen. I can't quite guess how other governments will respond. It is a federal government program, so it becomes a little bit hard to know exactly what that will look like, what the negotiations would be, what the role of other provinces would be, in a little bit of uncharted territory with one province having a referendum on a specific federal program. But there could be movement in terms of its role in the Constitution, and perhaps one theory holds that the whole purpose of this is to start a broader conversation, not just about equalization, but about fiscal transfers generally, about the thick network of programs by which the federal government collects a lot of money and sends it to the various provinces. And that goes beyond equalization. And so maybe a referendum could trigger a rethink on a lot of those things, and then perhaps something good would come of it.
What kind of percentage do you think we would see of Albertans saying that, you know what, we shouldn't dish out so many billions of dollars each and every year through equalization? 80 to 90% of Albertans?
I won't speculate because I try and steer clear of public opinion and political guessing about political outcomes. But I'll say this, and for Alberta, equalization is a large federal program. It's about $20 billion a year. program. And it's a program from which Albertans receive no direct benefit. So the fact that it's unpopular in Alberta only makes perfect sense. And for taxpayers elsewhere, residents elsewhere in the country who struggle or who wonder why equalization is such a point of friction and tension, I think it's worth taking a moment to think about federal programs that such a large federal program that existed, let's say, that delivered no benefit whatsoever to Ontario. Would we expect it to be popular in Ontario or Quebec if there was a big federal program that, as big as $20 billion that delivered no direct benefits to Quebec? Would we expect that program to be popular there? No. So the equalization's lack of popularity in Alberta makes perfect sense to me, and it is, in fact, in my view, entirely predictable.
You know, the equalization payments as well here in Alberta have given rise to the Wexit Party, the separatist party here in Alberta. You know, people are saying we should take our money and run. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's a political outcome in and of itself. But there are huge advantages to being part of a larger, diversified country, particularly going through difficult times such as now that we can see. And there's also there would certainly be a lot of political uncertainty, economic uncertainty from investors wondering, hey, what would something like that look like? And there's a lot of good evidence that political uncertainty is bad for the economy. It hurts growth. And things of that nature. So I think there'd be a lot to worry about in terms of the effect on political stability, investors thinking, hey, what's this going to really look like? And we saw that. We saw that happen in Quebec a lot of during the separatist movement. A lot of businesses and capital fled out of Montreal. And so it's something to keep in mind that there can be damage caused by the uncertainty that these things can create.
Now, Ben, you kind of touched on this a little bit earlier about the current equalization program. Provinces receive payments based on their fiscal capacity, but how else does it work?
Well, the fiscal capacity calculation is quite complicated. What that means is it evaluates each province's ability. Let's say they all have the same tax rates. If you would generate more money, you have higher fiscal capacity. If you have less money, you have lower fiscal capacity. But it also calculates. It also includes natural resource revenue. Approximately 50%. It's 50%. The formula is a little quirky and not worth getting into, but for the sake of simplicity, natural resource revenue also feeds into that, and that's problematic in terms of the incentives that it creates, because in have-not provinces, Quebec, Manitoba, there's been disincentives towards the actual generation of natural resource revenue because people respond to incentives. When they see their receipts of those revenues go up, equalization goes down almost commensurately. So certainly it's very important when we're looking at equalization and its related programs to take a hard look at what are the incentives that this is creating, and is it creating incentives for growth? Is it creating incentives for national cohesion? Or is it creating incentives for different kinds of public policy and frankly serving to create tension? And when the program is creating tension rather than unity, I'd go so far as to say that it's really failing to achieve one of its key purposes, which should be to bring Canadians together.
Why do you think Ottawa would come up with like Bill C-69, preventing a lot of oil pipelines and regulations on our energy sector when you need that money to help support equalization payments? It's like cutting off your nose to spite your face, the expression goes.
And that, I think, is a major source of frustration in Alberta, that there's a sense, and not just a sense, there has been real challenges to the creation of energy infrastructure in the province that have been created by policymaking in other parts of the country. And that is a huge source of frustration. Albertans, like people in any other province in the country, want to prosper. They want to be able to make use of natural resources they have. They want to be able to get global prices for their resources rather than something less, which is what happens when you have a lack of pipeline access. So I think on that point, and certainly all of Canada benefits from a prosperous Alberta. As you say, it contributes more to equalization payments. Not just equalization, though. It contributes more per person to all federal programming when Alberta's thriving and people are making high incomes and paying high income taxes. All of Canada benefits from a strong Alberta. And in fact, Canada is badly weakened by a weak Alberta. And so certainly frustration surrounding laws that made the development of the energy infrastructure impossible for so long. I think frustration surrounding that is entirely reasonable.
Ben, an oil tanker carrying Alberta crude just completed a 1-month journey through the Panama Canal because there was no pipeline from BC to the East Coast, to carry that Alberta crude. That was a 12,000-kilometer trek. Ben, many agree this is simply ridiculous. Will we eventually see a pipeline from the west to the East Coast so people can use Alberta oil?
Well, I don't know what we will see, but I will because I try not to make predictions. But I will say this: the case for having moving oil through pipelines is very strong. Even particularly if we want to focus on the environmental effects, there's very strong evidence that if you move oil through pipelines, you're much less likely to create environmental damages at the local level than if you move it all the other ways that you can move it. You move it by rail. You just mentioned a long voyage of a ship. Something can go wrong. Can easily go wrong there. But certainly the evidence is crystal clear that pipelines are a much safer way to move oil across the country than oil by rail, which is the number one replacement when pipelines don't exist or are inadequate. So from an environmental perspective, there's a very good reason to be supportive to the development of good, high quality energy infrastructure, including pipelines in Alberta, if the market can bear it.
Stats Canada says the Canadian economy has shrank by 8% over the first few months of 2020 because of the COVID-19 virus. Now, in your opinion, how long will it take for the economy to really bounce back?
Oh, I wish I knew. It's going to be a challenge. There's going to be a partial with the reopening. There will be a strong uptick. People go from no economic activity to some economic activity. But it's not going to drive you all the way back to where you started in terms of undoing all of the economic damage. There's still big challenges in terms of getting people to work safely, making sure that people have safe places to put their kids so that they can go and do their jobs. I don't know how long it will take Canada to get out of this, to really get going again economically, get back to the place where it was before all this. I can't make a prediction on that front, but I can say it's not going to, I don't think it's going to be a really fast process because we haven't solved all the problems that we need to solve to get a recovery going full speed ahead.
Now, due to the changes in our economy, Ben, do you think maybe some of the current programs, the federal programs, are actually working?
They're achieving some of their goals while creating other obstacles. You think about a program like the CERB program, which is replacing income that's been lost for people, and that has certainly achieved certain goals, some very important goals in terms of bridging people through hardship, helping families that otherwise would have been in terrible circumstances and perhaps faced insolvency. So it's certainly achieved some of its very important objectives. But now we're reaching a point where, as you mentioned, the issue of recovery has come about, and there's now real questions about incentives for people to return to work. If people can make almost the exact same amount of money on CERB as they would going to work a 30 or 40-hour week, it's entirely logical that they might prefer not to do that and protect their health better, stay inside, all kinds of good reasons. That's not to suggest that people making those decisions are in any way lazy or gaming the system. It's that people respond rationally to incentives. And if we have a long period of time where we pay people not to work, there might be a very good reason for that during a crisis. I think there was a good reason for that during the crisis. But as long as you have it, it's going to be an obstacle to getting full employment again, and it's going to be an obstacle to getting the kind of full speed ahead recovery that we would all like Canada to have eventually, and once it's safe.
So maybe some policy changes that would improve the situation, such as maybe phasing out the CERB payments?
It's going to have to be. I think it's going to have to be phased out eventually. It can't go on like this permanently. It's extremely expensive, and we're already seeing deficits pile up at the federal level, over $300 billion. Yeah. The provinces themselves are facing fiscal challenges. My view is that CERB is going to have to be unwound eventually. Unwinding it won't be easy. Especially if the economy hasn't fully recovered. There's always going to be concern. You don't want a situation in which you're creating terrible economic hardship for Canadians. So you want to be sensitive to the challenges of the COVID recession while recognizing that if you pay people not to work as much as they would to work indefinitely, you're going to have labor market problems. So I don't envy any of the people making these decisions. They're hard choices. They're difficult policy changes. But the programs that have been implemented, the CERB program, the CEWS, the wage subsidy, they're simply, in my view, not sustainable in the long run. And the governments need to be thinking now about how they're going to unwind them, because I'll tell you, it's not going to be an easy trick.
You touched on that. You're right. The deficit is $343 billion. The debt's approaching $1.2 trillion. So, and I mean, this is money that we have to pay back eventually. Ben, how much will the new NAFTA or the USMCA really help our economy get back on track?
It certainly is better than if there were lots of new protectionism. There was sort of concern of that a few years back that fundamentally there might be fundamental changes in the Canada-U.S. trade relationship. That doesn't seem to have come to pass, and that's good news. Freer trade between Canada and the United States has generally helped the economy and been good. That said, in the short term, we have we have barriers between our two countries that would have been unimaginable a year ago in terms of not having people being able to flow back and forth between the two places, disruption of commerce and supply chains. So free trade between Canada and the United States is great. It won't be able to have its full positive effects until we're able to open up borders again and let people go back and forth. And that's not probably going to happen until the virus is under control in both countries, which is potentially some ways away.
Ben Eisen, Senior Fellow from the Fraser Institute, thanks for joining me today from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Thank you for having me.
On behalf of all of us here at BCN, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless, and thanks so much for watching.